Carol Hensley's hands shook so hard against the steering wheel that the paper in her fingers fluttered like a trapped bird. The word malignant sat there in black ink, small and quiet and terrible, and in the passenger seat 42 pounds of tan and white fur pressed against her thigh. The dog she had named Birch looked up at her with those dark, knowing eyes, the same eyes that had found her through a frozen pane of glass 3 weeks before, on the night she almost did not open the door. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments what part of the world you are listening from, and hit that subscribe button so stories like this one always find their way to you. The scratching had come just after 10 on a Tuesday night in February, and Carol remembered every second of it, the way you remember the second before a car hits ice. She had been sitting on the couch in the old farmhouse outside Staunton, Virginia, with a mug of tea gone cold in her hands, and the television playing a rerun of a cooking show she had already seen twice that week. The wind was doing that low, hollow moan it always did when the temperature dropped below 15. The weatherman that evening had said 12 degrees, said the ice would keep coming through the morning, said everybody who could stay home should stay home. Carol had not planned to open the door for anything, not for the mail, not for a neighbor, not for God himself. Then she heard it, a soft, dragging scrape against the storm door, followed by a pause, followed by 3 quick taps. She sat up straight. She thought at first it was a branch, because branches had been coming down all evening under the weight of the ice, hitting the porch roof and the gutters and the aluminum siding on the shed. But branches did not pause. Branches did not tap in sets of 3. She waited, and the scratching came again, faster this time, more insistent, and underneath it she heard a thin, high whine, the kind of sound that could only come from something alive and something suffering. She stood up, her knees cracked. She was 58 years old, and it had been a long time since she had moved fast for anything. She crossed the living room in her wool socks, past the framed photograph of her sister on the piano, past the coat rack where her late husband's old barn jacket still hung, though he had moved out 11 years ago and had never once come back to ask for it. She turned on the porch light. She looked through the glass. He was standing there on 3 legs, holding the 4th up against his chest as if it hurt too much to put down. His coat was a dirty tan color, matted with sleet and mud, and there were dark patches around his eyes where the fur was crusted with something she did not want to think about. He was medium-sized, maybe 40 pounds, maybe a little more. He looked at her through the glass, and she thought later that in her whole life she had never been looked at quite like that by any living thing, human or animal. It was not begging. It was not the flat, empty stare of a starving stray. It was something else entirely. It was a plea addressed to her specifically, as if he had walked 3 miles through the ice on purpose to reach her door. Carol did not open it right away. She stood there with her hand on the deadbolt, and she thought of all the reasons not to. She thought of the pipes she still had to wrap in the basement. She thought of her insurance. She thought of the way her ex-husband Richard used to tell her she took in every broken thing she ever saw, and that was exactly why they were always broke themselves. She thought of Duke. Duke had been her German Shepherd mix, and Duke had died on a spring morning 11 years ago, 3 days after Richard packed up his truck and drove out to the highway and did not turn around. She had come home from the vet's office alone that afternoon, with the empty leash in her hand and the smell of antiseptic still in her hair, and she had sat on the porch until it got dark, and she had told herself out loud, in a voice that scared her a little, that she was never going to do that again. Never. Not another dog. Not another anything that could look at her the way Duke had looked at her at the end. She had held to that promise for 11 years. The ice cracked in the big oak that stood by the porch, a sound like a rifle shot, and a chunk of frozen branch the size of a fist came down and shattered on the top step. The dog flinched, but did not move. He kept his eyes on her. And Carol Hensley, who had told herself she was never going to open her door to another animal as long as she lived. thought very clearly, very simply, nobody deserves to die like this. She turned the deadbolt. She opened the inner door, then the storm door. The wind hit her in a wall of cold that made her eyes water. The dog took one step forward, then stopped and looked up at her as if asking permission for the second step. She nodded. She actually nodded at him, like he could understand it, and he came through the doorway on his 3 good legs and stopped on the mat and stood there dripping, waiting. She closed the door behind him. She locked it. She turned around and looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them moved for what felt like a long time. Then he lowered his head and let out one small, exhausted sigh, and she felt something inside her chest, something she had bolted shut 11 springs ago, come loose all at once. She did not sleep much that night. She spread out an old blanket by the heating vent in the hallway and coaxed him onto it with a bowl of warm rice, mixed with a little chicken broth from a can. He ate like he had not eaten in days, but not like he had never eaten before, which told her he had known a home once. He drank half a bowl of water and then curled up so tight he looked like a comma against the wall. She sat cross-legged on the floor across from him, not touching, and she watched him breathe. He watched her back, one eye at a time, until finally sleep took him. In the morning, she called the county animal control office and left a message on the recorded line describing him. She called the vet in town, Dr. Ellis, who had been her vet back in Duke's day and who was still practicing at 71. She asked if anybody had reported a lost dog matching that description. He said no, but he told her to bring the animal in and he would scan for a chip and check the paw and take a look. She wrote all of that down on a yellow legal pad, and while she was writing, she noticed the dog had gotten up from the blanket and had come to stand beside her chair. He was not asking for food. He was not asking for a walk. He was just standing there, pressed against her left calf, warming himself against her. She called him Birch on the drive to the vet's office. She had not planned to name him at all. She had told herself over and over that this was a temporary situation, that she was going to find his people or find him another home, that she was not, absolutely not, going to keep him. But at the stoplight on Route 11, she looked over at him in the passenger seat and she saw the 2 small white patches behind his ears, one on each side, shaped like little birch bark curls against the tan of the rest of him, and the word was out of her mouth before she thought it. Birch. He turned his head when she said it. He did not react to any other word, just that one. Dr. Ellis scanned him for a chip and found nothing. He looked at the paw and said it was not broken, only badly bruised, probably from stepping on something sharp under the ice. He estimated the dog was between 4 and 6 years old. He said the teeth were good, the coat under the mats was healthy, and the dog was not underweight, only cold and scared and hungry from what looked like maybe a week of wandering. He said, in the careful voice vets use when they are trying to tell you something without telling you, the dogs did not usually end up on porches in 12-degree weather unless somebody had turned them out on purpose. Carol did not answer that. She paid the bill, and she signed the paper that made her his temporary legal keeper pending the 30-day hold, and she took Birch home. For the first 2 days, he stayed close to the heating vent. He ate when she put food down. He drank when she filled the bowl. He went outside to do his business and came right back to the door. And if she took too long letting him in, he would sit there on the porch and look at the door with the patient certainty of a dog who had been left outside once and did not want it to happen again. He did not bark. He did not play. He did not wag his tail. He was polite in the way of a guest in a house not quite his own. Then, on the 3rd morning, he did the thing. Carol was standing at the kitchen counter in her old blue robe, waiting for the coffee to finish, when he came up beside her and pressed his nose hard against her left side, just below her arm, not the shoulder, not the hip. That specific spot, the soft place a few inches under the armpit where the ribs turned to give. He pushed hard, then pulled his head back, then looked up at her. Then he pushed again, then he pulled back and looked up at her again. She thought it was nothing. She laughed a little. She said, "Well, hello to you too, buddy," and she reached down to scratch his ears. He allowed it, but the moment her hand left his head, he pressed his nose right back into that same spot. Push, pull back, look up, push, pull back, look up. She moved away from him. She poured her coffee. He followed her to the table and sat down at her feet on her left side, and when she sat, he stood up and pushed his nose against that spot again. Carol was a practical woman. She had been practical her whole life. She'd grown up on a small tobacco farm outside of Waynesboro. She had put herself through nursing school by working 2 jobs. She had spent 31 years as an intake nurse at a rural clinic that saw more uninsured patients than any other clinic in the county, and she had learned early that people believed all sorts of foolish things about their bodies because they wanted to, and that dogs did not know one thing more than dogs know. So when Birch did the pressing thing again the next morning, and again the morning after that, always the same spot, always the same deliberate pause, she told herself he had a quirk. Maybe he had done this with somebody else, and it had gotten him a treat or a laugh, and now he was doing it with her because he wanted the same thing. She started ignoring him. When he pressed, she moved. When he pressed again, she gently pushed him back with her hand and said no in the firm voice she used to use with Duke. He would stop. He would sit down and look at her, and in the morning he would come back and do it again. By the end of the first week, she had started to hate the pressing. It was not painful. He was not rough. But there was something in the way he did it that made her uneasy in a way she could not name. He was so specific. He never pressed the right side. He never pressed her stomach or her back or her leg. He never barked or whined. He would just approach her from the left, put his nose exactly where he had put it every other time, push, pull back, and stare at her with those dark eyes as if she were being unbelievably slow about something obvious. On the 10th night, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror in her nightgown, and she lifted her arm, and she looked at that place on her side. There was nothing there. No lump, no discoloration, no pain when she pressed. She was healthy. Her last mammogram had been 18 months ago and had come back clean. No flags, no callbacks, nothing. She was healthy. She was fine. She lowered her arm. She turned out the light. She told herself it was over. The next morning, Birch pressed her side again. 2 days after that, on a bright, wind-scoured Saturday, she was carrying 2 grocery bags out to the driveway, and the ice under the mailbox had refrozen overnight, and she was concentrating on not falling, and she did not notice that she had left the storm door swinging behind her. She loaded the bags into the passenger seat. She got in. She turned the key. She started to back down the long dirt driveway that ran 200 feet from her house to the county road. And she was almost to the road when out of the corner of her left eye she saw a flash of tan and white moving fast alongside the car. Birch was running. He was running flat out down the driveway, 30 pounds heavier than a dog his size should have been able to move that fast. And he was closing on the front of her car, and she did not understand what he was doing. And then she did understand, and she stomped the brakes so hard, the car slid 3 feet on the frost and stopped with the front tire not 2 inches from him. She could see it. She could see the exact distance, 2 inches. She got out. She did not close the door. She walked around the front of the car, and her legs were not working right. They felt like water. And Birch was standing there in the middle of the driveway with his sides heaving and his eyes on her, and she went down on her knees on the frozen dirt, and she grabbed him by the scruff of his neck with both hands, and she pulled him against her, and she did not know if she was going to yell at him or cry or do both, and she did neither. She just held him. She held him for a long time. He did not squirm. He put his head over her shoulder and he leaned his weight into her, and she felt his heart hammering under her hand, and she felt her own hammering to match it, and something inside her went very still. She thought, he was trying to reach me. He did not want me to leave. And then, in the same second, in a voice that was not exactly a thought, but more like a knock on a door she had been pretending was not there, she thought, he has been trying to reach me since the 3rd morning. She sat back on her heels on the driveway, and she looked at him, and he looked back at her, and she said, out loud, to a dog she had known for 11 days, all right, I hear you. She drove back up to the house. She put the groceries away. She sat at the kitchen table for 1 hour, and she looked at nothing. Then she picked up the phone, and she called Dr. Angela Morton's office, and she asked for an appointment. The receptionist, a woman named Beth, who had worked that front desk for 20 years, asked her what the appointment was for. Carol opened her mouth and then closed it. She could not say the truth. She could not say, my dog keeps pushing his nose against my ribs. She said, I would like to move up my annual. Beth said the next available was in 6 weeks. Carol said, is there any way you can put me in sooner? Beth said, is there something specific you want to be seen for? And Carol Hensley, who had been a nurse for 31 years and who had watched people die because they were too embarrassed to say a symptom out loud, said quietly into the phone, yes, there is something specific. Dr. Morton called her back herself an hour later. Angela Morton was in her early 40s, tall and calm and a listener, and she had been Carol's doctor for 6 years. Carol told her the whole thing, from the porch to the pressing to the driveway. She braced for laughter. Dr. Morton did not laugh. She did not even sound surprised. She said, Carol, I want you to come in tomorrow morning. I'm ordering a scan. I know you had a clean mammogram last year. I want to do a diagnostic one anyway, and I want to add an ultrasound. She said, if it is nothing, then it is nothing, and we will both feel silly. But I would rather feel silly than the other thing. Carol went in the next morning. Birch stayed in the car with the window cracked. The technician was a young woman named Maria who was kind and quick, and the scan took less than half an hour. Dr. Morton met her in the little consultation room afterward. She said the images had gone straight to the radiologist for a preliminary read, and she would call as soon as she knew. Carol drove home. She sat on the porch with Birch's head in her lap, and she watched the sun move across the yard, and she did not answer the phone the 2 times a telemarketer called, but when it rang the 3rd time, she picked it up on the first ring. Dr. Morton's voice was gentle. She said, Carol, I am going to ask you to come in this afternoon. We found something. It is small, it is early, but I do not want to talk about it on the phone. The drive to the office was the longest 20 minutes of Carol's life. She sat in the little room with the paper-crinkling table, and Dr. Morton showed her the image on the monitor. There was a small, dark shape, the size of a garden pea, cleanly bordered, in the exact spot Birch had been pressing his nose for 2 weeks. Dr. Morton said, we caught it very early. We are talking about lumpectomy, radiation, probably no chemo. The 5-year survival rate at this stage is above 98%. But Carol, if we had waited for your regular annual next fall, we would be having a very different conversation. Another year would have changed the outcome. Carol did not cry. She listened. She asked the right questions in the calm nurse voice she had used with 1,000 patients in that clinic. She wrote things down on the yellow pad she had brought with her because she had known driving in that she would need to write things down. She scheduled the biopsy for the following Wednesday. She shook Dr. Morton's hand and she walked out to the parking lot. She sat in her car for a long time. She looked at Birch in the passenger seat. He looked back at her. She reached over and she put her hand on the top of his head, very carefully, as if he might dissolve, and she said, out loud, to a dog, thank you. She drove home. She walked into the house. She sat down on the hallway floor with her back against the wall, and Birch came and climbed into her lap, all 42 pounds of him, and he pressed his face against her chest and went absolutely still. She held onto him with both hands, and she did not move for a long time. That night, she filed the found animal notice with the county shelter, and she signed the paperwork that would start the 30-day hold. If nobody claimed him in 30 days, he was hers. Legally, officially hers. She was not letting him go anywhere. The biopsy the following Wednesday confirmed what Dr. Morton had suspected. Small, early, ductal, treatable. Surgery was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Carol drove home from that appointment, and she told Birch about it in the car, out loud, the way she had used to talk to Duke. And Birch listened the way Duke had listened, with the tilted head and the patient eyes. She thought that was the end of it. She thought the story was she had opened a door on a cold night and a dog had saved her life. She thought she would recover and she would grow old with Birch beside her, and someday she would tell the story at a Thanksgiving table and people would say, "Isn't that something?" She had no idea the story had barely started. It was 2 days after the biopsy that she took Birch back to Dr. Ellis for his shots and a full workup. And it was in the waiting room of that little vet's office in Staunton that a woman she had never seen before turned on the bench across from her and stared at Birch as if she had seen a ghost. The woman was maybe 50, in a wool coat that had once been nice, with a bichon frise on her lap. She looked at Birch. She looked at Carol. She looked at Birch again. She said, in a voice that was not quite steady, "Excuse me, ma'am. Is that Ruth's dog?" Carol felt something cold move through her stomach. She said, "I'm sorry?" The woman said, "Is that Ruth Callahan's dog?" Sadie, wasn't that her name? "He looks just like her." "My God, he looks just like her." Carol said, "His name is Birch. He came to my door in February. I don't know Ruth Callahan." The woman's face did a small, complicated thing. She said, "Ruth Callahan lived out on Willow Spring Road, about 8 miles from here. She passed away last October. Breast cancer. She had a dog just like that one, same color, same little white patches behind the ears. Ruth called her Sadie, but the woman had rescued her from someplace, so that might not have been her real name." Carol did not remember standing up. She did not remember the technician calling her name. She heard the woman's words over and over. Breast cancer, last October, same dog, Willow Spring Road. Dr. Ellis took Birch in for the workup and asked her twice if she was all right. She said she was fine. She sat in the little exam room and she stared at the wall and she thought, this cannot be a coincidence. This cannot be what it sounds like. That night at home, she got out her laptop and she typed Ruth Callahan's Staunton, Virginia obituary into the search bar. It came up on the second result, a short piece from the local paper dated October 7th of the year before. Ruth Elizabeth Callahan, 67 of Willow Spring Road, passed away Sunday morning at her home following a 2-year battle with breast cancer. She was preceded in death by her husband Kenneth. She survived by her son, Douglas, of Richmond, and one granddaughter, Emma. Ruth was a beloved 4th-grade teacher at Staunton Elementary for 34 years before her retirement. She was known for her love of gardening, her rescue animals, and her tireless work with the County Humane Society. Carol read it 3 times. 4th-grade teacher, Staunton Elementary, 34 years. She sat very still. She said the name out loud, Ruth Callahan, Ruth Elizabeth Callahan. She was crying before she knew she had started. She had been in Mrs. Callahan's 4th-grade class in 1973. She had been 8 years old. Her mother had just died of breast cancer that August, and Carol had gone to school in September wearing her mother's rosary under her uniform blouse and had not spoken to anyone for the first 3 weeks of the year. It was Mrs. Callahan who had noticed. Mrs. Callahan, who had sat with her at recess and eaten half a peanut butter sandwich in silence beside her every single day for a month, until Carol finally, one Thursday, opened her mouth and said, "My mother is dead." and Mrs. Callahan had said, "I know, sweetheart, I know." And she had not tried to fix it. She had just kept sitting there, eating half a sandwich until Carol was ready to eat again. Carol had not thought about Ruth Callahan in maybe 30 years. She had moved away for college. She had come back to the area after nursing school. She had never gone to find her old teacher. She had meant to. She had told herself for decades that she was going to drive out one Sunday and knock on Mrs. Callahan's door and thank her. She had never done it. And now, 40-something years later, Ruth Callahan's dog had walked 8 miles through ice in the middle of the night and had stood on Carol Hensley's porch and had refused to leave until Carol opened the door. Carol sat in the kitchen with the laptop still open and Birch at her feet, and she did not know what she was supposed to do with any of this. She drove out to Willow Spring Road the next morning. The little farmhouse was easy to find, a white clapboard place set back from the road behind a low stone wall with a for sale sign at the mailbox and a padlock on the front gate. The garden was gone to weeds. The lace curtains still hung in the windows. Carol sat in her car at the shoulder of the road and she looked at the house and she thought, this is where he lived. This is where he learned to do that thing. She was there maybe 10 minutes when a pickup truck came down the road from the other direction and slowed and pulled onto the shoulder behind her. A man got out. He was in his mid-40s, big through the shoulders, in a canvas coat with a knit cap pulled low. He walked up to her window and knocked on it. Carol rolled it down. He said, "Ma'am, this is private property. Can I help you?" Carol said, "I'm sorry. I was just looking. I knew Mrs. Callahan a long time ago." He said, "Everybody knew Mrs. Callahan." His voice was flat. He looked past her into the car, and his eyes stopped on Birch. His whole face changed. He said, "Is that Sadie?" Carol said, "His name is Birch. He came to my house in February. Nobody claimed him." She said, "Are you her son?" "Douglas?" Doug Callahan opened her car door without asking. He knelt down beside the passenger seat, and he looked at Birch. And Birch looked back at him, and there was no tail wag, no lick, no recognition. Birch leaned away from him slightly and pressed himself against Carol's shoulder. Doug stood back up. He said, "That is my mother's dog. That dog went missing the day of the funeral. We had people in and out of the house all afternoon, and somebody left the back gate open and she was gone by sundown. We looked for 2 weeks. We had flyers all over the county. Then it got cold and I figured she was dead." "Where do you live?" Carol told him. She did not want to tell him, but she told him. He said, "Well, ma'am, I appreciate you taking care of her. I will come by tomorrow afternoon to pick her up." Carol felt the floor of her stomach fall out. She said, Wait, please. She has been with me for over a month. She has settled in. She was in a shelter hold, and nobody claimed her. Doug said I did not know where to look. I did not know she was in a shelter. She has a chip." Carol said, "She does not." The vet scanned her. There was no chip. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "My mother did not believe in chips. She thought they gave dogs cancer." He said it like it explained everything. He said, "Tomorrow afternoon around 3. I appreciate your understanding." He walked back to his truck. He drove away. Carol sat in her car with Birch pressed against her arm, and she could not breathe. She called the county animal control office when she got home. She talked to a very polite young man who read the file and said, "Ma'am, the 30-day hold expired on March 15th. He is your dog now, legally. If somebody wants to contest that, they have to go through the courts. There is no automatic reversion just because an original owner shows up." She called Dr. Ellis. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Carol, I remember Ruth Callahan. She brought her animals in for years. She had that dog for maybe 2 years before she died. Named her Sadie. She told me she had adopted her from a rescue outside of Charlottesville. She said the dog was 5 years old and had come in as an owner surrender. I do not know anything before that." "I am so sorry," Carol said. "Do you know if she trained her?" for the pressing thing. Dr. Ellis said, Ruth Callahan was diagnosed a year before she passed. She never mentioned any training. But Carol, if that dog was doing that with her, and Ruth knew, she never told me. I want you to know that. Ruth was a private woman about her diagnosis. She might have known things she never said. Doug Callahan came the next afternoon in his pickup truck. Carol met him on the porch with a manila folder in her hand. She had spent the entire night on the internet and on the phone with a lawyer who had once been a patient at the clinic where she worked. A woman named Renee Ford, who did small-town family law and who did not charge Carol a dime for the 2-hour phone consultation. Carol had the shelter paperwork. She had the vet records. She had the 30-day hold expiration. She had, in Renee's careful handwriting on a note card at the top of the folder, the words, "Possession is 9/10. Do not surrender the animal without a court order. Be polite. Do not argue on the porch." Doug stood at the bottom of the steps and he looked up at her. He said, "Ma'am, where is Sadie?" Carol said, "Mr. Callahan, I would like to talk to you. Please come up on the porch." He came up. She did not open the door. She said, "I called animal control. The 30-day hold expired. He is legally my dog now. I understand this is painful. I want to work with you. I would like to invite you to come and see him whenever you would like. But I am not giving him up." Doug's face went red under the cap. He said, "That dog belonged to my mother. My daughter has been asking about that dog since October. She is 9 years old, and she has been through enough this year already. You do not know what you're talking about. I am taking her home." Carol said, "No, sir, you are not." He took one step toward the door. He was a big man, and Carol was 5'4". She did not move. He stopped. He looked at her for a long second. He said, "We will see about that." He walked back to his truck, and he drove away with his tires spinning on the gravel. Renee Ford called Carol that evening. She said he can file a civil claim. He can argue conversion, which is basically legal speak for saying you took his property. If he does, you will end up in front of a district court judge, and the judge will look at the shelter hold, the vet records, the fact that he did not claim the dog for 4 months, and the fact that his mother did not have the dog chipped. You are going to win, but it is going to take a few months, and it is going to be miserable. Are you prepared for that?" Carol looked down at Birch, who was lying across her feet under the kitchen table. She said, "Yes." Renee said, "All right, then we get to work." 2 weeks later, Carol had the surgery. It went exactly the way Dr. Morton had said it would go. The margins were clean. There was no lymph node involvement. She was home the next afternoon. She began the 6 weeks of radiation 10 days after that, driving 35 minutes each way to the cancer center in Charlottesville. Birch rode in the passenger seat every single time. He waited in the parking lot in the winter sun, and when she came out, he pressed his nose against her hand, and she scratched his ears, and they drove home. The civil summons arrived in the mail on a Tuesday. Doug Callahan had filed. The hearing was set for 6 weeks out in the last week of May. Renee Ford took the paperwork and started building the response. Carol did not sleep well. She had never been in a courtroom in her life. She had visions of losing him. She had visions of standing in her yard and watching Doug's pickup truck drive away with Birch's face pressed to the back window. She would wake up at 3 in the morning with her heart racing, and she would reach down and put her hand on the floor by the bed, and Birch would be there, warm and breathing, and only then could she go back to sleep. It was during that stretch, in the 3rd week of April, that the second thing happened. Frank Delaney lived next door. Well, next door in the country sense. His farm shared a fence line with Carol's back pasture, and his driveway came off the same county road about a quarter-mile down from hers. Frank was 72. He had lost his wife Eileen 2 years before, and since then Carol had made it a habit to bake a loaf of banana bread every couple of weeks and drop it off with him on Saturday mornings, because that is what people in that part of Virginia do. Frank was a proud man, hard of hearing, stubborn about doctors. He had not been to a doctor since Eileen's funeral. Carol drove over that Saturday with a loaf of bread and Birch in the passenger seat. Frank was on his porch, fixing a broken step. He straightened up and waved. She got out. Birch got out. Birch did not usually go to Frank's porch because Frank did not care for dogs in his flower beds, and Birch respected that. But on this particular Saturday, Birch walked straight up to Frank Delaney and pressed his nose against his side. Not his stomach. Not his ribs. Higher. Right up under his left arm. Frank laughed and pushed the dog gently away. He said, "Hey there, fella, you sniffing for jerky?" Birch pressed again. Same spot. Same pause. Same deliberate stare up at Frank's face. Carol felt her stomach turn over. She said, "Frank, Frank, when was the last time you saw a doctor?" Frank straightened up and looked at her, and his face got that stubborn set to it. He said, "Carol, you are not about to start on me, too." She said, "Frank, please, listen to me for a minute." She told him the whole thing. The porch, the pressing, the diagnosis, the doctor's words, the surgery she was in the middle of recovering from that he had not even known about. She told him about Ruth Callahan. She told him what Dr. Ellis had said. She said, "Frank, this dog does not press. He does not do it to anyone. He has never done it to anyone I have introduced him to since me, and he just did it to you." Frank was quiet for a long time. He looked down at Birch. Birch looked back at him. Frank said, "Carol, I have not felt a lump. I have not felt anything." Carol said, "I had not either." Frank looked out at the fields. He said, "Eileen kept telling me before she died that if anything ever came up, I had to go get it checked." He said, "I promised her I would." He said, "I have been putting it off 2 years." He looked back at Carol. He said, "All right, I will go Monday." He went Monday. He came home Monday afternoon and called her from his kitchen. His voice was thin over the phone. He said, "They scheduled me for a scan on Wednesday. The doctor felt something. He said, 'Carol, I did not feel it.' He said, 'I never would have gone if you had not come over on Saturday.' The scan on Wednesday showed a small tumor in Frank Delaney's left lung. It was not what anybody wanted to see, but it was operable. The surgeon told Frank he had gotten there just in time. Word travels fast in a county like ours. It traveled fast in this one. By the first week of May, Dr. Ellis had been telling the story to his other clients. Beth at Dr. Morton's office had been telling it to her cousins at church. Frank Delaney's brother had told the story at the volunteer fire department pancake breakfast, and half the county had heard some version of it by Sunday afternoon. The county newspaper called Carol. She did not want to talk to them. She let it ring 3 times, then she picked up. She thought about Birch, about Ruth Callahan, about the fact that Doug's hearing was in 3 weeks, and she told the reporter the whole story from the top, from the scratching at the door in February to Frank Delaney's phone call in April. She left nothing out. The story ran in the Sunday edition. It was picked up by 2 Richmond papers by Wednesday. By the following Sunday, it was on the Associated Press wire and had run in one form or another in 27 states. A woman in Oregon called Carol at 9 at night to tell her that her chocolate lab had done the exact same thing to her sister 3 years earlier and had been ignored, and her sister had died the following spring. Carol turned the phone off at 10. She sat on the couch and Birch put his head in her lap and she said out loud, "Well, buddy, we are famous, I guess." Renee Ford called her Monday morning. She said, "Carol, I need you to sit down. Have you seen the local paper?" Carol said, "Yes, I gave the interview." Renee said, "No. Today's paper. Have you seen today's paper?" Carol had not. Renee said, "Doug Callahan just filed an amended claim. He is not just seeking return of the dog anymore. He is seeking custody transfer plus, and I want to make sure you understand this, plus a portion of any future proceeds from what he called, and I am quoting here, commercial exploitation of the dog's abilities. He is claiming his mother trained the dog and that any value the dog has now belongs to her estate." Carol did not say anything for a long time. Renee said, "Carol, are you there?" Carol said, "He wants to sell him. He wants to sell Birch to somebody. Renee said, I think there is a company. There are companies now that train cancer detection dogs. They pay a lot of money for animals that already show natural aptitude. I am guessing Doug has been in contact with one of them since the story went national. I am guessing that is what changed his math. Carol Hensley, who had spent 31 years quietly making sure poor patients got the medicine they needed, put her hand over her mouth so that Birch would not hear the sound she made. She said, Renee, what do we do? Renee said, we go to court. And we prepare very carefully, because if this judge decides your possession is not strong enough, we lose him. For the next 2 weeks, Carol did not sleep well, and she did not eat much, and Birch would not leave her side. He followed her from room to room. He slept on the bathroom floor when she took a shower. He put his head on the closed lid of the toilet while she brushed her teeth. He rode with her to every radiation session and every doctor's follow-up. He did the pressing thing 3 more times, always on the same spot, always at the same soft, insistent pace, and Carol let him because she understood now that it was not asking for anything. It was checking on her. Renee pulled together the evidence. She had the shelter records, the vet records, the animal control statement that the hold had expired, and the sworn affidavits from Dr. Ellis, Dr. Morton, Frank Delaney, and 3 other neighbors who had known Carol for decades. She had a written expert opinion from a veterinary behaviorist at the University of Virginia who reviewed the case and stated that dogs raised by one owner can transfer bonded behaviors to a new owner within a matter of weeks, and that the animal in question showed clear signs of a full attachment reset. Doug Callahan hired his own lawyer, a man from Richmond named Peterson, who wore a bow tie and spoke in the tone people use when they are trying to sound reasonable while asking for something unreasonable. He filed motions. He requested discovery. He tried to have the case moved out of Augusta County. All of it failed. The judge, a woman named Harriet Whitaker, who had been on the district bench for 18 years and who did not suffer nonsense, ruled that the case would be heard in Staunton on the scheduled date and that both sides would come prepared. 3 days before the hearing, on a Thursday evening in late May, Carol was on her front porch shelling peas from her garden when a small blue sedan pulled up her driveway. She stood up. She had not been expecting anybody. Birch came out from under the porch swing and stood beside her, and she rested her hand on his head. The driver of the sedan was a young woman, maybe 22, with dark hair pulled back and a face Carol did not recognize. She got out. She had a manila envelope in her hand. She walked up to the porch and she stopped at the bottom of the steps and she said, in a voice that was very careful, "Are you Mrs. Hensley?" Carol said, "I am Carol." The young woman said, "My name is Emma Callahan. I am Ruth Callahan's granddaughter. I am Doug Callahan's daughter." Carol did not move. Emma said, "I know you have every reason to close the door on me right now. I'm asking you to please not do that. I drove up from Blacksburg tonight. I have something my grandmother wrote before she died, and I do not think my father knows about it. I need to give it to you." Carol looked at her for a long moment. She could see, now that the light hit right, Ruth Callahan's face in this girl's face. The same set of the mouth, the same eyes. Carol said, "Come up. Sit down." Emma sat on the porch swing. She put the manila envelope on her lap. She said, "My grandmother raised me the last 2 summers of her life. Because my mom moved out to Colorado when I was 15 and my dad worked shifts and could not really handle a teenage girl. I lived with her out on Willow Spring in the summers. I was with her when she got sick. I was there the night before she died." She took a breath. She said she wrote 3 letters that last week, one to me, one to my dad, and one that had no name on it. She said I would know when to give the 3rd one. She said, "Emma, you will know." Emma opened the envelope. She took out a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, in a woman's tidy schoolteacher handwriting. She said, "I saw the news story last week. I saw your face. I looked up who you were. I found out my grandmother was your fourth-grade teacher, and I knew tonight that she meant this letter for you." She handed it to Carol. Carol took it with hands that shook. She unfolded it. The letter was dated September 28th of the year before, 9 days before Ruth Callahan died. It said, "To whoever finds Sadie next. If you are reading this, then Sadie found you the way she found me, and I am no longer here to explain it to you. She is not an ordinary dog. She spent her first 3 years with a woman named Margaret, who was training her for a scent detection program in North Carolina. Margaret got sick before the program was finished and had to give her up, and I found her in a rescue in Charlottesville the same week I was diagnosed with cancer myself. Sadie knew before my doctor did. She kept pressing her nose right where the tumor was. I already knew, so I did not need her to tell me, but I understood what she was doing. I am not going to survive this. My doctor is very kind and very honest, and we have both known for a while now. What I know about Sadie is this: she needs to be with someone who will listen to her. She does not do the pressing for everyone. She only does it when there is something to find. If she finds you, please do not turn her away. Please do not put her in a program or a kennel or sell her to somebody who wants to use her. She has done enough work for one lifetime. Let her be a dog. Let her sleep on the couch. Let her ride in the front seat. Let her live a quiet life with somebody who will love her the way I have tried to. Whoever you are, thank you for opening the door. With love, Ruth Callahan." Carol read the letter twice. Then she put it down on her lap, and she covered her face with both hands, and she cried harder than she had cried the day her mother died, harder than she had cried the day Duke was put to sleep, harder than she had cried the afternoon Dr. Morton had said the word malignant. She cried until her shoulders shook. Emma Callahan sat quietly on the swing beside her and did not say anything. Birch climbed up onto the porch swing between them and put his head on Carol's knee. When Carol could speak again, she said, "Does your father know about this letter?" Emma said, "No. My grandmother told me not to give it to him. She said he would not understand. She was right. He does not understand. He has been fighting with me for a month about this. He thinks I am ungrateful. He thinks I am siding with a stranger. Mrs. Hensley, my dad is not a bad man. He is a scared man. He lost his mom last fall, and he lost his marriage the year before, and he lost his job 3 months ago, and I do not think he knows what he is doing. He heard about a training program in Pennsylvania that pays $40,000 for dogs that pass the intake, and he thinks that money will fix everything. It will not fix anything. And even if it would, my grandmother did not want this dog to be sold." Emma looked at her. She said, "I will testify. On Monday, in court. I will testify for you. I will read my grandmother's letter into the record. My dad is going to hate me for it. But my grandmother told me I would know, and I know." Carol reached across the porch swing, and she took Emma Callahan's hand, and she held it. She said, "Sweetheart, your grandmother would be so proud of you." Emma said, "She was your teacher." Carol said, "Yes." Emma said she talked about her students all the time, all the way up until the end. She had names she remembered from 50 years ago. She had a folder of old class photos in her desk. I bet you are in one of them. Carol drove Emma to the little motel out by the interstate that night, and she paid for her room for the weekend. And Emma said she would drive back Monday morning for the hearing. Carol drove home. She sat on the porch. Birch put his head on her foot. She looked up at the big oak tree that stood by the driveway, the tree whose branch had cracked in February, and she said quietly out loud to nobody in particular, "Oh, Mrs. Callahan, you are still teaching me. All this time, you are still teaching me." The hearing was Monday morning at 9. Carol wore a navy blue dress she had bought for her nephew's wedding 6 years before. Renee wore her courtroom suit. Frank Delaney came in a jacket and tie that did not quite fit him anymore, and sat in the second row of the small courtroom with his surgeon's report in his hand. Dr. Ellis was there. Dr. Morton was there. Emma Callahan slipped in 5 minutes before 9 and sat in the back with her grandmother's letter in a fresh manila envelope, and her father, coming in the other door with his lawyer Peterson, did not see her at first. Judge Whitaker took the bench at 9 sharp. She was a small woman with silver hair and reading glasses on a chain. She did not smile. She read the case number aloud. She looked at both tables. She said, "Gentlemen and ladies, this is a civil dispute over a companion animal, complicated by an amended claim for future proceeds. I have read all of the filings. I have read the shelter documentation. I have read the affidavits. I understand that emotions are high on both sides. What we are going to do this morning is take testimony in an orderly fashion. There will be no speeches. There will be no theatrics. Are we clear?" Both lawyers said yes, Your Honor. Peterson went first. He put Doug Callahan on the stand. Doug told the story from his side. He talked about growing up with his mother's rescue animals. He talked about the day of her funeral, the open gate, the search. He said he had done everything he could to find the dog and had been told by a neighbor that Sadie had likely been hit by a car or taken by coyotes. He said that when he learned the dog was alive, he had come immediately to Mrs. Hensley's home and had attempted to reclaim what belonged to his mother's estate. He said the dog had value now, and that value belonged to his family, not to a stranger. Renee cross-examined him. She was polite. She did not raise her voice. She asked him if he had chipped or licensed the dog under his mother's name at any point in the 2 years his mother had owned her. He said no. She asked him if he had contacted any of the county shelters during the 4 months the dog was missing. He said he had called the Augusta County shelter once in October and had been told nothing had come in matching the description. She asked him what had prompted him to file the amended claim seeking future proceeds. He hesitated. She asked him if he had been in contact with a training facility in Pennsylvania called K9 Detection Partners. He said yes. She asked him what they had offered him. He looked at his lawyer. His lawyer nodded. He said $40,000 up front, contingent on the dog passing their evaluation. Renee said, "No further questions." Then she called Carol. Carol told her story from the beginning. She kept her voice steady. She talked about the porch, the pressing, the driveway, the diagnosis. She talked about Frank Delaney. She talked about the day she had driven out to Willow Spring Road and Doug had told her he was coming to take Birch. She said she had complied with every legal requirement of the shelter hold. She said she loved this dog. She said she was not going to sell him. She said she had made a promise to a dog on a hallway floor in February that she was not going to break. Peterson cross-examined her. He asked her if she was aware that the animal had originally belonged to Ruth Callahan. She said she had learned that after the fact. He asked her if she had, upon learning it, made any effort to contact the Callahan family. She said no. She had learned it 2 days before Doug Callahan himself had approached her, and she had not had the chance. He asked her if she had, since the newspaper story had run, received any offers herself for the dog. She said yes. She had received 7 offers, one of them for $55,000, and she had turned all of them down. He asked her to state that on the record. She did. He said no further questions. Frank Delaney testified next. He was brief. He held up his surgeon's report. He said, "That dog saved my life, and I did not even ask him to." Dr. Ellis testified about the scans, the lack of chip, the shelter process. Dr. Morton testified about the diagnosis and the timeline and stated for the record that in her medical judgment, a delay of even 6 months in Mrs. Hensley's case would have led to a materially worse prognosis and possible reduction in survival rate. Then Renee said, "Your Honor, I would like to call one more witness, Emma Callahan." Peterson stood up so fast he knocked his water glass over. He said, "Your Honor, we were not notified. Emma Callahan is a hostile witness. We object. Judge Whitaker looked at him over her glasses. She said, "Counsel, this is a civil hearing on the disposition of a family pet. It is not a murder trial. Emma Callahan is on our witness list as of 8:47 this morning by written amendment, which was permitted under the local rules of continuance. Sit down." Peterson sat down. Doug Callahan turned in his chair. He saw his daughter walking up the aisle for the first time. His face went white. Emma took the stand. She was sworn in. She sat down, and she smoothed her skirt over her knees, and she said her name very clearly. Judge Whitaker asked her age. She said 22. Renee said, "Miss Callahan, please tell the court your relationship to the defendant." Emma said, "He is my father." Renee said, "And your relationship to the deceased, Ruth Callahan?" Emma said, "She was my grandmother. She raised me the last 2 summers of her life. She was the closest thing to a mother I had." Renee said, "Miss Callahan, do you have in your possession a document relating to the disposition of the dog in question?" Emma said, "Yes, I have a letter my grandmother wrote 9 days before she died. She wrote 3 letters that week, one to me, one to my father, and one addressed to whoever found her dog next. She told me I would know when to give the 3rd letter. I am giving it now." The bailiff took the letter from Emma. He handed it to the judge. Judge Whitaker put on her glasses and she read it. The courtroom was completely silent. Carol could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. Peterson opened his mouth twice to object and closed it both times. Judge Whitaker took her glasses off. She said, "Miss Callahan, is this in your grandmother's handwriting?" Emma said, "Yes, ma'am." Judge Whitaker said, "Do you swear that this letter has been in your possession, unchanged, since it was given to you?" Emma said, "I do." Judge Whitaker said, "I am going to enter this letter as evidence. Miss Callahan, would you please read it aloud for the record?" Emma took the letter back. Her hands trembled, but when she read, her voice was clear and steady and beautiful, and she read every word. When she got to the end, to the line that said, "Please do not put her in a program or a kennel, or sell her to somebody who wants to use her," she looked up from the paper, and she looked directly at her father. Doug Callahan had his face in his hands. Emma finished the letter. She folded it back up. She said quietly, "My grandmother did not want this dog sold. My grandmother wanted this dog to have a home. Mrs. Hensley has given her a home. I am not testifying against my father. I am testifying for my grandmother." The courtroom stayed silent for what felt like a long time. Judge Whitaker took a long breath. She said, "We will take a 15-minute recess." Everybody stood. Doug Callahan stood up from his chair and he walked out of the courtroom without looking at anybody. Peterson followed him. Carol looked at Emma. Emma was crying quietly on the stand. Carol crossed the aisle and she put her arm around Emma's shoulders and she held her until Emma could stand up. When they came back 15 minutes later, Doug Callahan was not with his lawyer. Peterson stood up alone. He said, "Your Honor, my client has authorized me to withdraw all claims in this matter. He wishes to be heard briefly if the court will permit." Judge Whitaker said briefly, "Counsel." Doug Callahan came in through the back door. He walked up the aisle and he stopped at the front table. He did not look at Peterson. He looked at Carol. He said, "Mrs. Hensley, I owe you an apology. I owe my daughter an apology. I owe my mother an apology, but I cannot give her one anymore, so I am giving it to you and to Emma in her place. I have been ashamed of a lot of things this last year. I am ashamed of this too. My mother wrote what she wrote and she meant it. The dog stays with you. I withdraw the claim. I do not want $1. He stopped. He looked down at his hands. He said, "Thank you for taking her in." Judge Whitaker looked at Peterson. She said, "Counsel, please prepare the withdrawal paperwork. Case dismissed with prejudice. Costs to the plaintiff. This court is adjourned." She rapped the gavel one time and she stood up. She looked at Carol over her glasses and she nodded once, a very small, very quick nod, the kind of nod that judges do not usually give in courtrooms. Then she walked out. Carol did not remember standing up. She did not remember walking down the aisle. She remembered Emma hugging her at the door and whispering, "My grandmother would have loved you." She remembered Doug Callahan reaching out and taking her hand for exactly 1 second and then letting it go. She remembered Frank Delaney putting his arm around her and walking her out into the sunlight on the courthouse steps. Birch was in her car, in the parking lot across the street. She could see him through the windshield, sitting up straight in the passenger seat, watching for her. She crossed the street, and she opened the door, and she got in, and she put both hands on his face, and she pressed her forehead against his, and she said out loud, in a voice that was not quite her own, "We did it, buddy. We did it. We are going home." The story ran again in the papers that Sunday, this time with a photograph of Carol and Birch sitting on the porch steps of the old farmhouse, and a shorter piece about Emma Callahan and her grandmother's letter. A woman in New Hampshire started a small grant fund in Ruth Callahan's name to help retired rescue dogs find homes with families that would let them just be dogs. Frank Delaney's surgery went well. He was cancer-free at his 6-month check. Carol finished her radiation in the 2nd week of June. Her first clear scan came back in October. She and Birch drove out to Willow Spring Road one Sunday afternoon that fall, and they stood at the padlocked gate of Ruth Callahan's old farmhouse, and Carol said, "Thank you, Mrs. Callahan. Thank you for the 4th-grade sandwiches. Thank you for the dog. Thank you." Emma Callahan came to visit that Thanksgiving. She brought a boy she was dating from Blacksburg, and she brought a folder of old photographs she had found in her grandmother's desk when they were finally cleaning out the house that summer. In one of them, taken in 1973 in front of a chalkboard that said May 12, 28 second-graders and 1 4th-grade class stood squinting into the sun in front of Staunton Elementary. Second row, 3rd from the left, was a small girl with dark hair and a solemn face, and if you looked closely, a rosary just barely visible at the collar of her uniform blouse. Carol looked at the photograph for a long time. Then she gave it back to Emma and she said, "Keep it. Put it in a frame. Put it somewhere your kids will see it someday and you can tell them the story." Emma did. Doug Callahan sent Carol a Christmas card that 1st December with a note in his own handwriting that said only, "I am glad she has you. Merry Christmas." She sent one back. They sent them every year after that. The following spring, on a bright, cool April morning, Carol Hensley walked to the end of her driveway with Birch beside her, and she stopped at the big oak tree. She stood there for a moment, looking up into the branches. The branch that had cracked in the ice 14 months earlier was long since fallen, cut up, split for firewood, burned in the wood stove all winter. New growth was already coming in green, where the old branch had been. She put her hand on the rough bark of the trunk. She looked down at Birch. She said out loud, low enough that only he could hear, "I almost didn't open the door." He looked up at her with those dark, knowing eyes, the same eyes that had found her through a frozen pane of glass on a February night when the wind was moaning and the temperature was 12 degrees, and she had told herself for 11 years that she was not going to do this again. She scratched him behind one white-patched ear. She said, "Thank God I did." They walked back to the house together in the spring sun. The world is full of doors, and it is full of things scratching to be let in. And most of us, most of the time, do not answer because it is late, because it is cold, because we are tired, because we have already told ourselves that we are not going to do this again. Carol Hensley almost did not answer. If she had not, this story would not exist. She would not have known she was sick until it was too late. Frank Delaney would not have known about his lung until his grandchildren were reading his eulogy. Emma Callahan would never have delivered her grandmother's final letter, and a good dog named Birch would have died in the ice under an oak tree, One more small loss in a cold Virginia night. She answered. That is the whole story. She answered, and the answering changed everything. If this story moved you the way it moved me to tell it, take a moment right now to hit that like button. Drop a comment about a time an animal changed your life or the life of somebody you love, and go ahead and subscribe if you have not already, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you, and I would love for you to hear them with us. And the next time you hear a small sound at your door on a cold night, remember Carol Hensley and go see who is there. You never know whose life you are about to save. It might even be your own.